Well, thanks for having me, everyone. I want to thank Darcy and all of you for having me. Sorry, my voice is a little bit raspy. I'm suffering from a little bit of coming back from a cold, and my flight got in at 3:30 this morning, so I'm also a little drowsy. You know, mechanical failure on United. But Darcy has been excited about this conference and excited about this community that she works with since the first day I met her. And Darcy's definitely true. When Darcy showed up in DC, I've been in DC a couple years more, and getting policy done in Washington, DC is definitely one of those things which starts as a black box, and then increasingly you learn more. So it was a kind of pass on the knowledge type exercise. I figured what we could do and continue to, you all should continue to eat, and just sort of talk about some of the things that we as the administration have been doing, and just really use that as fodder for a question and answer and conversation about what you guys find interesting. A lot of things that we work on come out of conversations like this where folks say, hey, have you heard about this? Or this is a really powerful trend. So let me just give you a little bit of orientation. So I work for the President's Science Advisor. So this was an office that was created under President Eisenhower, who wanted sort of a civilian advisor for science advice. But the office has kind of grown as science and technology policy has grown into a bunch of areas. So we focus on environment, we focus on national security, science, and technology. And I function as the education guy in the office. So I both think about the president's focus on math and science education, as well as the role of technology in education, so educational technology. So Darcy and I end up working on that quite a bit. I've been in DC. I came to DC to serve the president, so I've been in DC for about 3 years. And I've got to say that it's been an incredible experience. Part of what makes it really incredible is when the issues that you work on are something that the president cares deeply about. And so one thing that we always find remarkable is, one thing we do whenever the president is going to give an event is work with speechwriters on his speech. But one thing we always look for is how much does he go off prepared remarks and just kind of riff for a while in the speech. And I'll say that when it comes to science, innovation, education, his speeches are usually like 30 to 40% longer than what's written down, because he just finds it really a really important thing. And part of the reason why he finds it so important is because, he sort of thinks about it as a building block. In all the conversations we have with him, he's trying to think about what are the policy decisions we can make now that sort of pay off in the 10 to 20-year time frame. And so what can we do on the education and technology forefront that pays off down the road? So that ends up mean that we make a bunch of long-term bets when it comes to policy that we hope will pay off. So I figured, it's always good to sort of think about when we sort of think about both in higher education and in K-12, what are some of our goals when it comes to using science, technology to help education? So I just sort of threw 3 up there that would be great to get your thoughts on. One is that how do we sort of get better at improving courses and programs? So often when we sort of think about educational programs, we sort of say, hey, here's a course we want to teach, and how can we make it better by making the content of it a little bit sharper, making it more relevant to students. But I think the big opportunity that we face as a country is how do we start to get to programs and courses that improve the more students use them, right? Where in lots of other areas of technology, Amazon search becomes more and more powerful the more customer reviews people leave. So the actual power of the crowd actually improves the technology. So I think this is a big area of opportunity going forward, where if we can improve courses, the more students use them, it creates a feedback loop of improvement. The second, and I think this is obviously something that people talk about a lot, which is how do we customize to the needs of individual learners, right? So the standard model that people presume for education is a one-to-many model. An instructor, a number of students, and folks are going through the material at the same time and at a similar pace. But as folks know who work in the community college space, in the K-12 space, in the higher ed space, is that more and more we're realizing that the more you can customize the learning experience to the actual challenges of the student, to what their life is outside of the school environment, the more you can get done. And different people struggle with different things. And then the third is, how can we actually have this have an impact on completion and on wages and jobs? So one thing that wasn't clear to me when I showed up in DC is, well, so you're a policy guy that works for the president. What is your actual toolkit for action? And so this is something that in our early coffees, Darcy and I would talk about a lot, because Darcy says, okay, so I'm now a policy person at the Department of Labor. What does it mean, and how do I get things done? So I would say that there's a number of things that when you want to make progress in an issue that we sort of think about. One is sort of what are ways that we can, most policies instantiated in documents. So we think about things like executive orders or agenda setting documents. So when it came to the president's call to invest in community colleges, that first started as a policy proposal that got developed and then eventually got rolled into the president's budget. So the budget is a second big area, which is where agencies spend their money and how they do it. Working with Congress on legislation, which depending on what year it is, goes up or down for likelihood. And then, the very fact that the president talks about an issue actually gives us a really powerful moment to make progress on it when we're working with our private sector partners, with foundations and others, because we can use that as an opportunity to talk about things that are happening. And then the most underappreciated that I certainly didn't know when I showed up at the White House is the real power of the bully pulpit that the administration has, which is a lot of times, and I think you guys must interact with this all the time, is people want to do more, and they want to collaborate, and they want to make progress on an issue. So if you take that really seriously and say, okay, well, the thought experiment that we do is, if you're President Obama and you could call on anyone and ask them to do anything, who would you call and what would you ask for, right? So start with that open question and then start to say, okay, well, if we think social media is a big deal and we think that more and more students are looking at what their friends are doing on Facebook, how could Facebook be part of a conversation around spreading, getting one student that's interested in computer science, get another student interested in computer science. So you can start to have really powerful conversations when you realize that everybody walks, every day people walk through our door and say, how can we help? From companies to foundations. And thinking about what those connections are can be really powerful. So I've already told you a little bit about what I'm hoping to cover. So let me sort of go through the experience that, and some of the things that we've done on community colleges. So this is why I talk to Darcy all the time. She is lead for one of the president's most important initiatives, which is that we made a historic $2 billion investment in community colleges. So from sort of early on in the administration, there was a real emphasis on saying, community colleges are an area where an immense amount of learning is happening. It's where adult learners go, it's where students go in large numbers, and that they are a national asset that needs to be invested in and that can have transformative potential. So out of the healthcare compromise came $2 billion for community colleges, which landed at the Department of Labor. And just to show you how policy then starts to lead into practice, one of the things when we originally announced that the president was going to invest in this area was that this money would also support an online and open source clearinghouse of courses, a charge that Darcy then has to think about, which is how do we build this repertoire of courses. So the president announced the $2 billion and we got the money. One question that we had was, well, what are other folks who can step up to make this investment more impactful? So I wanted to sort of give you a sense of what that all hands on deck effort looks like. So one was this idea that how do we build courses? And one area that's been really exciting for us has been this idea of open course development. So let me get at, do you guys, for a show of hands of who knows sort of what this term of our open course development is, right? So the reason why we thought this was interesting is a lot of times when we sort of talk to folks who are engaging in instructional design, it's an input-output model, right? So people say, okay, I want to develop a course in this area. I'm going to interview a bunch of subject matter experts, think about instructional design, build the course, come up with assessment items, and then put the course out there, start to pilot it, and then eventually go to broad adoption. The problem that seems to happen is a lot of times once the course gets to that level, the ground may have shifted. So the body of knowledge is slightly more advanced, especially in new technical fields. And the second thing is things that people realize once the course is done, they might say, well, actually, we needed that module to be a whole lot bigger. Or students seem to really struggle with this concept, but we go through it in like 15 minutes when maybe this is a real choke point for learners. So open course development says, how can you design a course where you can continue to invest, right? So you actually pare the front-end investment down to give yourself more resources to engage in modular improvements along the way. And that's a hard step, right? Because it's one thing to sort of think about it as, hey, I'm developing an app, I'll do all the work, I'll develop the app, and I'll publish it on the App Store. It's another if it's a continuous process. So this is something that a number of both foundations, CMU is doing this work, and so we got interested in how can the fact that there's going to be this major investment by the Department of Labor in courses, how can we make these things connect up? And so that led to a collaboration where there's now an open consortium which includes, and Darcy can tell me the full list of players, but it includes Creative Commons, includes CMU, includes Gates and others. And the real idea is to provide more of the grantees for these community college grants access to this kind of developmental model. And then one story I have down here as to what you can do when you do open course development is you can have much more powerful data return back to a bunch of different communities, right? So usually what happens is when people say, oh, we want to customize a course, people say, okay, well, customization allows you to do more targeted feedback to the student. But you could also do more targeted feedback to the teacher, right? So people use different terms of art for this, like flipped classroom and that sort of thing, where the idea is once you sort of know what different students are struggling with, you can actually be much more targeted in your response. But it also can give feedback to the course designer, right? So if it's an open course, they can say, oh, we should build this module out more. And it can actually give feedback to learning research itself, right? Which is, learning scientists are fascinated by what sort of cognitive traps students fall under. You could actually start to give a lot more feedback on that. And one great story that shows once you start to instrument these learning environments, what you start to get is one that Wireless Generation gave me, which was, they work in early literacy, and because they use these clickers, they've developed this massive data set of students in early learning. And they were interested in this perennial question when you're teaching students the alphabet in early literacy of whether you should teach the letter B or the letter D, close or far apart, right? And this is a big debate. And they said, well, we have this huge data set. Instead of trying to come up with the answer on the front end, let's just run the regression and see what pops out. And what they found out was that was something that wasn't in the research literature, which is it turned on whether the student is an English language learner, right? So if English is your native language, it's actually better to teach them close, and if it's not, it's better to teach them far apart. And they couldn't find, and they couldn't find anybody who'd actually turned it on that variable. So once you start to have really large data sets and you start to involve the research community, you can start to have conceptual understanding and run experiments that other folks might not be able to run. One other analogy I would make is, in the internet space, they have this thing called A/B testing, right? So the way Zynga figures out whether the apple should be like yellow or green is they pick 1/7 of the Zynga universe and just flip the color and then see if people do anything different. And so they get real live feedback as to changes in the process. So similarly, once you start to have a large data set of different students going through, you can turn one variable and see if that leads to any big changes. So this is an area which I think we're on the early end of, but it gives us immense possibilities because our presumption is that it could change the way we do learning research itself, which is if you can do huge numbers of micro experiments, it won't take 10 years. So a lot of times when I talk to scientists who do this work, it's a 10-year lag time. You have a new conceptual leap in understanding something. You then say, okay, well, here's a new test material, get it into some classrooms, collect the data, publish the data. It's like 8 years later, and then folks are like, well, that's not really what is the hot issue now. So the question is, how do we give people a fighting chance to actually publish in a schedule that other people can do? Another partnership that we work to build alongside the community college space is something that Darcy's been talking about, which is the role of badges. So here was another example where we were going to be building these courses for community college students, and there's a growing movement in the philanthropic community around what they call alternative credentialing systems. And the reason why they're interested in this area is the way Mozilla and other people frame it is, there's lots of things that we're expert at that we don't make visible to employers, our colleagues, our friends, and others. And the problem with us not making it visible is, one, we're less likely to do it if we can't make it visible. And then two, it's harder to stack skills. So when people say, and badges is like because there are Boy Scouts badges and Girl Scouts badges, people sometimes fall into just that definition. But badges can be sort of thought of as a 21st century resume. What are all the different things that you're working towards that you may want to make visible? And one of the reasons that we're interested both in the higher ed and K-12 space is in the K-12 space, I actually think that badges can be a really powerful way to bring a bunch of activities in the after-school space together, right? So a lot of times what happens is, if you sort of think about earning a black belt in karate, right? It's a layered activity. So you do a whole bunch of little things that you're learning, but you're layering up and you're earning credentials along the way. Well, a lot of things that we do in the K-12 space don't have that. So we might say, oh, I went to a NASA camp, or I built a robot, or I did this thing, but they're one-off activities. But we have the potential to say, NASA can say, we want to take you through from cadet all the way to like space explorer. And so badge 1 all the way to badge 200. And it can actually layer all its activities from really easy to really complicated up that ladder. And then it also solves another problem, which is a lot of times the goodies we have to hand out are in finite supply, right? So when I talk to NASA, their big problem is they've got all this really cool stuff, but they can only have so many students come onto a NASA campus and do like a co-op or an internship. You can have only so many students that can like go on a zero-G flight, maybe 200 a year. But if you use a badge framework, you could say, hey, when you unlock badge 50, up the ladder, that's when you get it. So you might have hundreds of thousands of students start at a certain level, but then a select few that go all the way. And so then the fact that you have limited resources is just built into your system of design. I think for adult learners, there's huge potential here as well. And this is something that Darcy really helped us think through, which is a lot of times for adult learners, they're entering and exiting higher education due to lots of different things. And what are ways that instead of just it being an incomplete, they can actually document what they've learned so that as they're entering the workplace, they're switching careers, those things become more visible. This is happening more and more in the IT space, and I think it has huge potential. So Stack Overflow is this website where you answer very technical programming questions, and you can earn badges if you're answering really well. And more employers are hiring people who have a really high Stack Overflow badge score. So it becomes an alternate way for people to show value. Another partnership that we did alongside the community college investment was one with the Joyce Foundation in Aspen. And here, the idea was how to use a prize model to be able to do more work with community colleges. So one thing that they pointed out was that there wasn't yet a prize to sort of say, here are the community colleges that are doing the best job. And part of the reason why part of it was, that there hadn't been enough of a focus on this. But the other part was, once you start to say, well, who gets to be in the top 10 or who gets to be the best, is you actually need a lot of data. What are you going to be holding people accountable for? But this led to a really powerful collaboration between the Department of Education, the Joyce Foundation, and Aspen. Of the 1,200, they were able to pick the 120. Those 120 all submitted a huge amount of data to compete. And then they had a final winner. And And what was really interesting is that first, the community college experts I've talked to that track the data piece of this, they found that more data came out of this $1 million competition to give an award than huge amounts of notice and requirement that they've been doing in this area. So it just goes to show where the foundation said, hey, what if we just incent people to share this information? How can this happen? The other thing is the community colleges got really into it. And they competed, they found additional partners and said, help us compete for this stuff. And so a prize model helped sort of elevate those models. Now, from a policy standpoint, that becomes really useful as well, because you can then roll that back into our policy things. So Darcy can say, hey, what should the next TAA grant look like? And we've got some model that might be exceptional in some of these areas. Just to throw this out there, just if you guys want to look it up on your own, we are really big as an office into prizes as an innovation tool. The reason why we are is in certain areas, when you put a prize purse out there, you can actually push the community to innovate past where it already is. So this was one that was done by the Hewlett Foundation, and their question was, could we push the current state of the field on automatic scoring of exams? Now, the reason why this is a big policy issue is in the K-12 space, in about 3 or 4 years, we're going to switch. There's a huge investment that we're making on next-gen assessments, where we're going to switch to digital assessment. Students are going to be taking tests on computers. And there's a big tension between open-ended exams, where students are writing essays, and grading of those exams. It's expensive. How do you do it? So one area that the philanthropic communities and others are interested in is, can you take some of that load off? So as you have teachers examining, can they have additional help to at least give them a spot score as to what a student has done? So they threw a modest sum out there on Kaggle and tried to have a bunch of companies and public solvers try to solve this area. And what was interesting was the results were, the public competition pushed past where the private vendors were, and in some of the results, they were getting to almost as accurate as human graders. Now, this is all machine learning. The computer is basically picking up on sentence structure, but it could be a huge aid to human graders because they could then use that as a first cut and then read past that. Another area that we were interested sort of to tie the community college conversation to was our interest in entrepreneurship. So the president has been very focused on giving more, building entrepreneurship into all our other initiatives, which is how do we both celebrate entrepreneurs, but how do we make it more likely that students, adults, and others feel capable, have the incentives to start their own businesses and grow jobs. And so this was an area where, again, people said, hey, well, couldn't we link this up with community colleges? And there's now an association that's going to community colleges and having community college presidents sign up where they're starting to build much more assets on their campus for community college graduates. And I think this is an area which will continue to grow. Some areas where we continue to sort of talk about, and I think there will be growing philanthropic and government interest, are these 3 areas. And I think Darcy has talked to some of you about these already. One is, what are ways that we can move the field into doing more competency-based assessment, right? So the value here is when we have a lot of adult learners and adult folks coming back into school, there's a huge transaction cost if there's no way for you to show what you know other than a seat time requirement where it says, well, if either you've done the course or you have to do the course, and so they're not able to start at where their knowledge base is. So this is something that unfortunately is expensive, right? Developing good competency-based assessment is expensive. So I think this is an area where employers and others who are very interested in getting more folks going into the space can actually potentially do cost shares where they can help develop competency-based assessments for the fields in which they're trying to recruit people so that people can show mastery much faster. Another area that we think is going to potentially continue to grow in interest and potentially has a lot of impact on developing really powerful courses is cognitive task analysis. So cognitive task analysis, we were chatting about this when we were just having lunch, is builds on sort of the past sort of 10, 15 years of what we're finding out about the way experts actually learn and the way experts actually teach. And the big insight is experts, if you put an expert in front of a classroom of novices, most likely the expert will fail to show the novices how to become an expert. And the reason is lots of research sort of on brain plasticity shows that when we become an expert, we actually rewire our brain. We make conceptual leaps. We start to see patterns. That's what becoming an expert is. We're able to make analogies. You put an expert in front of a classroom of novices, the way they will describe the material, they will make conceptual leaps that the students won't be able to keep up with. So cognitive task analysis sort of steps in the middle point and says that there's a way that we can actually play 20 questions with experts and actually decode the steps that they go through to become an expert. Now, this becomes really powerful once you actually try to, when you start to engage in technical fields, right? So the two examples I always use are where cognitive task analysis has been used is one is with emergency room nurses, especially with prenatal care. So they've done studies where under some nurses, no babies die, right? And so the question is, and they've shown that, that some nurses are expert at this. Now the question is that written in a book anywhere, or do we need to engage in a set of interviews with what set of additional factors are these nurses doing that allows them to be effective? And could we then code that and build that into actual nurse practitioner training? So that's an area of really powerful cognitive task analysis. Another area that the Department of Defense has done is on IEDs. So there are some of soldiers who are much more effective at spotting IEDs. So as you can imagine, DoD is very interested in figuring out what set of skills that they have that they might be able to train other folks on. So the reason why this is really powerful when you start to think about course design is if you've got a growing field and it's got an area of technical expertise that you may want your graduates to have, it's worth an upfront assessment of actually interviewing some of the experts in that area and then trying to decode that into the course. But again, it's one of those things where, you know, if you just put it on one person to say, hey, before you design a course, do a CTA, that might be burdensome. And so we really think this is another area for partnership where federal investment, philanthropic investment, industry investment, or consortiums of schools can really invest in this area and then use that to develop better courses. And then finally, an area that we are very excited about is there's a DARPA program, and we're big fans of DARPA because, you know, they end up unearthing a lot of really quality work through their grants. So DARPA was interested in, they have this big problem, which is they need really high quality IT graduates in their fleets. Because as you can imagine, if you get the blue screen of death while you're out to sea, that's a real problem. So they need really high quality IT folks. And so they said, well, currently it takes us X amount of training time to create those IT folks. Is there a way we could do it differently? And so they used a CTA type model, sort of assembled a whole bunch of really top IT folks, and then coded that into a digital tutor by first, you know, knowledge mapping what they did. But what they did was they actually watched them engage in hundreds of one-to-one tutorial interactions, where, you know, if you sort of watch a tutorial interaction, in an hour you'll have over 200 question-answer things happen, versus in a classroom setting, you know, that's cut by a factor. So then they coded that into a program and are now running this as a big experiment. They're running their first class through this digital tutor, and at the sort of 10 to 16 week mark, they're already beating the instructors and scoring as well as folks who have 7 years in the fleet. So this is one big experiment that DARPA is running, but it just goes to show for us, you know, that we're still at the bottom of this huge learning curve where, you know, they're basically having, you know, full mastery, you know, so not just, you know, can you solve the problem ticket. So this is, this was DARPA's slide on this as to how they went about this. But what I think is, that chart at the bottom, right, where they start to show how well their students are doing against experts. So I wanted to just, for these ones, I'll just quickly fly through it because I want to give ourselves time for questions. The other area that I work on is how can we do more on math and science education. This is something the president cares deeply about. Lots of things that we've been relying upon as a country, recruiting the top science and technology talent of the rest of the world to come live and work here, may not be around forever. And so we really want to build a culture of students going into these fields because these fields are going to become an ever larger part of the US economic base. This is where the jobs are. This is where the wage gains are. And so we think this is something where there's a really important role to play. So this is the president standing in front of a first robot when we launched this initiative. And it really was something where, in addition to a whole bunch of public investment that we're doing through the Department of Education, the National Science Foundation, we wanted to include our philanthropic and industry partners. So one thing that came out of it is a coalition of 115 organizations that are working on the president's plan to recruit and prepare 100,000 STEM teachers over the next decade. So they said, we asked Congress for $80 million, but they said, well, why don't we not wait for Congress and start to engage in philanthropic outreach? So they've already raised $25 million and are already launching a second fund. The National Math Science Initiative, which focuses on giving more AP courses to military children, especially in public high schools. They use a really powerful model, which is they basically looked at 150 high schools near bases that didn't have AP that said they'd be ready to take the program, which then we took to the Department of Defense, and we've already been able to get 50 schools funded. We also, in the K-12 space, think that there's a lot more that we can be doing to get school districts working together. Part of the challenge as to, if you think about the education market as a market, is it's super disaggregated, right? Which is why you have to have a huge sales staff, right? So you can't do the Instagram model of getting to 30 million users in 7 months, which is the way internet companies do it. And so when you have 15,000 school districts, it's really hard to aggregate demand. So an initiative that we helped launch is called League of Innovative Schools, where school districts representing almost 3 million kids are coming together and starting to demand educational technology together. And so the idea is that will spur entrepreneurs and researchers to do more work. Relating to it is that is a push for more R&D investment in this area anyway. So one of the things that we're always shocked by is, even in the potato chip industry, you have an R&D to sales ratio of 2 to 3%. And in knowledge industries like biotech and it's close to 20 to 30%. But in education, by our best estimates, we spend 1/10% on R&D. And so, that has a big impact. So we say, hey, how come it looks so similar? Well, we're just not making big enough bets, and so therefore, we're expecting the field to innovate without giving them enough ideas to innovate on. Another area that in the K-12 space we're very excited about is a growing movement called the Maker Movement. So this is the president. One thing that we did to sort of put science and math education front and center is we launched the first ever White House Science Fair. So we've done this 2 years in a row, and this is the president with Joey Hootie, who's a young maker with his Marshmallow Cannon. And I did not know that the cannon was live, but the president certainly asked him. And then he was like, yeah, no, we could shoot it. And so they got this thing up to 30 PSI, which means that it could shoot 178 feet. This is in the state dining room. They shot it over my head and hit the wall. Secret Service was grinning. But the president was having the time of his life, as you can tell. And so the reason why we're really interested in this is that, one thing parents and educators and all talk about is, so often we learn by doing, right? Dean Kamen has a great quote, which is, you don't teach football by lecturing about it for 9 years and then letting kids out on the field. Like we naturally learn by doing. And there's a growing movement of, that's getting younger and younger to have students build things in their own time, whether it's in a classroom setting, an after-school setting, or on their own, and then show up at a fair and show what they've built. And so we think this has a lot of potential to give students kind of our 21st century of the chemistry kit. So if you talk to a lot of people who work in technology, they'll say, yeah, what got me really into this, and I kind of blew up my room playing with the chemistry kit. Well, we've kind of outlawed the chemistry kit from the old days. And so we need to think about new ways to sort of give students the chance to make, and as the president put, a chance to destroy. And then I'll just throw out a new idea that we've been playing around with, is the president is launching a community of innovators that we're going to recruit to work in the administration called Presidential Innovation Fellows. And the idea is these folks who come in for a short stint to work on an area of presidential priority and then line up additional public and private support for it. So one area that we're interested in recruiting someone for is this thing that I told you about, which is how do we leverage big data, this growing amount instrumentation of the learning environments against learning challenges, and how do we start to instrument these environments so that courses improve on their own. Now this is something that is happening a lot in the private sector. A lot of both the nonprofits and private sector entities like Newton and others are building these huge data sets. And I think there's potential for having somebody who could work with them as well as some of the key federal agencies to think about how this can be a really powerful data set. I just figured I would throw this because folks will really enjoy it, which is one of the reasons why this idea of instrumenting the learning environment is also one that extends into our interest in games for learning. So we've actually recruited somebody to work on our staff that works full-time on games. And she's a learning researcher. And part of the reason she talks about it as so powerful is game designers in some ways think a lot about instructional design, they just don't know it, right? Which is, think about what you have to do when you design level 1 of a game, right? Not so hard that you don't keep playing and not so easy that you quit. And you sort of think about, hey, I'll learn a bunch of skills and then apply them in a later level. So what are ways that we can learn from this community and apply it to instruction? And then I wanted to end with a new announcement that we made this week. So at the Department of Education, they have a program called Race to the Top. It's a real priority for the president. We just launched Race to the Top District, which is about $400 million. And I think you all will be excited because it has a real focus on technology. So districts are going to be challenged to provide personalized education, which is really ambitious if you think about it, which is how do you move from a classroom where a teacher with 30 students into a much more customized educational model. Now, people think that technology can certainly be one solution. You could also imagine folding in out of school time, using skilled volunteers, and a bunch of other things. But I think this will really stretch districts. It's going to require a lot of participation from the community to really grow these models. But the draft rules hit the street this week, so I wanted to flag this for you all. Well, I've talked at you enough, and what they say about the way working memory works is that your brain fills up real fast, so I'm basically expecting that people just remembered that I work at the White House, and everything else is kind of a blur by this point. So, why don't we take questions or comments or things we should know about or all that stuff, and then, also feel free to tell us where we're totally off, because that's super useful too.
Yeah, thank you very much. Fantastic points and very encouraging, exciting. You flashed up digital promise, and I thought at one point that was sort of our DARPA, as someone has called it. I just wondered if you could update us on what you think its status is in the scheme.
Yes, that's a great question. So the president, so one thing that, as I sort of talked about, sort of our very low amount of investment in education R&D, we sort of think about it as a push-pull mechanism, right? So it's real hard to pull innovation from a really small investment. So DARPA, for example, I told you, is making some investment in this area. So we have a we think from a policy standpoint, we should be making some big bets in this area that the field can follow on. And so that led to the president's proposal to call for an ARPA Ed, which is similar to how there's an ARPA E, which built on DARPA, which is to make investments in breakthrough energy technology, which is to make breakthroughs in breakthrough educational technology. That proposal is before the Congress, yet unfunded. But we're working actively with the Hill on that. Digital Promise is a private corollary to it. So part of what Digital Promise is doing, it's got an independent board, an executive director. I think certainly it would work really closely with ARPA Ed, which would be situated within government, because I think there's a lot of potential for collaboration. But one thing Digital Promise is doing is making the case for more education R&D, which is as they're starting to build partnerships on the outside, what are ways that the federal government can invest more in this area? One thing that Digital Promise is doing to sort of think about it as a push-pull is, as I told you on the League of Innovative Schools, they want to demand more innovation. So if they can say, hey, if you build X thing, we will purchase it, we will purchase this many licenses of it, that starts to build a pre-market for innovation. But I don't think that doesn't mean we shouldn't be increasing our number of investments in education technology in the first place. It's a great question. Don't be shy. Otherwise, I'll just call on Darcy.
Our previous keynote, Mark mentioned that in order for us to advance is to educate and get out of the poverty levels. The poverty levels are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then today on the news, which I was very impressed, I was actually taught a lot of the stuff that's on the news this morning, and it really kind of sparked my interest. There was a student who was graduating from a local high school this year, and her family was in one of the homeless shelters. And she scored the highest level in her high school ever on her ACTs. And she credited a lot of it to the man that ran the homeless shelter, the SAM shelter, and saying that he was able to provide her with, through their funding, a laptop for her for high school, a ticket to go to, or funding for her to go to her college interview. Oh God, I'm on a mic. Look out. And also a gift card for an outfit for her interview and everything like that. So I guess basically what this is all leading up to is there plans out there. I'm not very politically inclined. I just don't like it.
That's okay.
But it did spark the thought, is there more funding out there for places like SAM shelters to do this for more people? Because not only is this a high school student, but there's got to be older people, older generations. I mean, I started when I was 28. I didn't start right out of high school. So is there funding? Is there planning on being more funding or more initiatives so that more kids or grown-ups or anything can get out of, get that access?
Yeah, so this is something the Department of Education thinks about a lot, right? Which is the educational health of a child is not limited to their 8 hours that they spend in a school day. So a lot of effort, there's a body of work all around sort of thinking about the whole life that the child is having. And so how do you link schools to community institutions? So homeless shelters, after-school opportunities, churches, the YMCA, Boys and Girls Clubs, and that sort of thing. And there's more of an emphasis on starting to make some of the granting the federal government does start to be more institutionally oriented. So there's a number of programs that the Department of Education runs called Promise Neighborhoods, which are about sort of, instead of just saying this is a grant to the school, it's a grant to the community to sort of think about the wraparounds that you might need. So you might actually put a health center on a school site because it actually draws the community closer in. You might actually keep the school open for community night, and so it starts to make the school a hub. So I think that's really powerful. And then I think your other point is that we have to just make sure that we're investing in our social safety net, because when that unravels, a lot of things that you might be trying to do on school reform, get impacted because students have immense problems outside the home. So I think they're both parts of it, which is how do we take a community view and how do we make sure that, community block grants and other programs that sort of support those institutions. So I don't work on those specifically, but usually we try to sort of say, are we catching what all sort of fits into the life of a child? Yes?
For the cognitive task analysis,
Mm-hmm.
will information from those results from that research, will that be made? For the can you hear me? Okay, for the cognitive task analysis, will that information be made available for those of us who are developing accelerated courses?
Yes, so Darcy can send you, there's a couple of different meta studies that have been done on CTAs, and there's a couple of really good experts on CTAs who I'm sure would love to contribute. So this is, it's a growing field, but it's still somewhat young, so we rely on a couple of key papers and a bunch of practitioners.
Thank you.
Darcy, what are your questions?
Oh, mine are way too long. Any more questions for Kumar?
Oh, yes.
Cost of education is increasing. We're putting more and more of that cost onto our consumers, the students.
Right.
Student loan debt now is higher than regular consumer debt. At the same time, our state legislative bodies are putting less and less funds towards general higher education funding situations. It's a wonderful call to arms here that you're doing here, but can you offer any other suggestions on how we might do this without asking our students to continue to pay for these?
Right. No, I think the Times has done a bunch of recent stories on this. This is something the president talks a lot about, which is cost of college continues to go up way past inflation. Some of it gets absorbed through grants and student loans, but we are, we both want to, there's a huge conversation happening right now on the interest rate on student loans. That's one small piece of it, which is just what is the cost to students on servicing their loans. But then there's a question of, what is the cost of college that those loans have to support? Because, if you're taking out a huge amount of loans, that, those have a big impact on sort of your life as a student. The president jokes about the fact that he only paid off his college loans and law school loans, 4 years before he ran for president. He and Michelle finally were debt-free. So I think this is a huge issue. I think we've sort of thought about it in a couple of different areas. One is, how do we think about innovation? So how are we providing people access to more capable courses, more options that allow them to learn faster? I think there's a second area, which is how do we sort of put as many incentives, both hortatory, which is just asking institutions to do more, but then also align policy around cost. So one big thing the president has called for is, we give a lot of resources through financial aid. We want to sort of have institutions which are having really high cost and price, net price, be sort of on notice that, our student loans aren't always going to flow, no matter where everybody goes. And so I think that's led to a very healthy conversations with institutions which are saying, I think very appropriately, that part of the reason for the cost increase are state cuts, but we just don't think we're on a sustainable trend right now. And so we both need to bend that curve through innovation, but we also need to have institutions say, there's been a number of really powerful studies which say that you can drive really powerful cost reductions in a bunch of areas in higher education if you just follow, certain models that some institutions are doing. So I think there's lots of potential for it. We're starting to align policy against it so that institutions have that incentive. And then, we want to make sure that, Pell doesn't get cut, and to the extent that, it would be even worse if you have inflation, you have a lot of cost increases, and we're actually cutting back on the opportunity for students to get loans. The part that has me hopeful is that if we can, there's a lot of folks that now are trying to innovate on price and starting to say, hey, value for dollar, here's how you can get more education. And I think that that's much more vibrant in higher ed than it is in K-12. And potentially that has the potential to create segmentation in the market that could, you know, give students much more price options. So, but this is a big, I mean, I think this is the big question, which is everybody's looking at this cost turn similar to healthcare and saying, you know, just do the math and where are we going? Well, thanks, guys. This was great, and feel free to, you know, find me. Is that good?